It's so amazing to see how utterly deluded preterists are. Utter delusion. Listen to this. Listen to what Jeff says about the dating of the authorship of the book of Revelation.
But this is Revelation. Now, I would argue, and it doesn't really matter if you disagree on this in terms of the point I'm making here, I would argue that Revelation was penned by the Apostle John before the destruction of Jerusalem. I think there's excellent internal and external evidence to teach that.
No, there is not. The internal evidence is laughable that Dr. Kenneth L. Gentry tries to give.
To believe that. Strong evidence, internal.
Nope, not strong internal evidence. Nope, not at all.
Well, I can't go into it all right now, but
Of course
that's my
not.
perspective. I think that can be demonstrated from the text, again, internally and externally.
Nope, not internally.
I think
nope.
that history shows some cool story here in terms of the Apostle John surviving, being the only surviving apostle that was able to witness the destruction of Jerusalem and die of old age. The rest were just martyred. But Nero captured John, boiled him in a pot of oil, according to church history.
No.
John didn't die. Nero was very superstitious, freaked out, so he sends John into exile to a place called Patmos.
Nope, that was under Domitian.
Writes Revelation. Again, I argue that it happened before 70 AD. Many would actually, I think on very, very bad evidence, a single line with ambiguous Greek in it, argue that Revelation was written later during Domitian's reign, somewhere around late 90s of the first century. But all that to say, it doesn't really matter in terms of the dating of Revelation.
Notice he said it twice now. Doesn't really matter in terms of the dating. Talk about lying to himself. He's lying to himself and lying to his listeners. Why? Because Jeff Durbin has to be dogmatic that the book of Revelation was written prior to 70 AD because he thinks that the vast majority of the book of Revelation concerns events that led up to and included the temple destruction and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But it's a prophecy. Therefore, it's foretelling the future from when John wrote it. And now Jeff Durbin will say, oh, yeah, it was the future, only the next, 3 to 4 years. But he has to be dogmatic about that because if it was written in 95 or 96 AD under Domitian's reign, then that totally overthrows all of his preterism. You see the inconsistency here? That's why he's lying to himself. You talk about delusion. The fact that he doesn't see that tells me that he's utterly blind to his own position. Utterly blind. So the preterist position, let's go preterism and futurism, opposed to each other, right? They're supposed to be opposed to one another. And that's what Jeff Durbin will bring out. Oh, it's all these futurists, dispensational futurists. Hey, I rip on dispensational futurists all day long. Here are the 5 main false teachings of the dispensational futurist eschatological system. 1, a pre-trib rapture. The false teaching that the rapture and the second advent are 2 temporally separate events. They are not. They are the same event. Followed by a mythical 7-year period of tribulation taken from a fallacious interpretation of Daniel 9:24 through 27 in the 70 weeks time prophecy, which is messianic. It's the messianic prophecy of Scripture. Of the first advent par excellence, because there's actually a time date time markers given for us. Number 3, that a single solitary individual, Nikolai Carpathia or Damien from the movie The Omen, the Antichrist, will only rise to power during this 7-year mythical period of great tribulation. A third temple in Jerusalem will be built. Antichrist will enter into it during his reign and claim to be God. This is taken from a fallacious interpretation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And that the majority of the book of Revelation, chapters 4 through 19 or 6 through 19, depending on what dispensational futurist you're talking to, will only be fulfilled during this mythical 7-year period of great tribulation taken from a mythical or fallacious interpretation of Daniel 9:24 through 27. They'll cram it all into this 7-year period of great tribulation. And of course, that the modern nation state that calls itself Israel has a pivotal role to play in end times events. And then they'll talk about Gog and Magog and being Russia and all this nonsense. And that at the second advent, then Christ will return and establish an earthly kingdom for 1,000 years. This is also fallacious. The millennium will take place, the second advent does precede the millennium, but the millennial reign of Christ and his saints will take place in heaven, not on the earth. So I can break down dispensational futurism a lot better than Jeff Durbin ever will, because he replaces the falsehoods, errors, and lies of dispensational futurism with his equal but opposite fallacious errors of preterism, coupled with his nonsensical postmillennialism. Preterism and futurism, opposed to each other, but they each accomplish the same goal, namely the diverting of men's minds from perceiving the truths contained in God's prophetic word, especially regarding the identity of the Antichrist. Here is the Reformation and post-Reformation. They were historicists, not preterists, and not futurism. Historicism is the only proper way to understand Bible prophecy. Utilizing the day equals year principle is imperative here. Preterism. Preterists interpret the book of Revelation, especially all the prophecies in Daniel, Paul, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and the book of Revelation concerning Antichrist as depicting events that took place in the distant past. Latin praeter, meaning past. Preterism. Either by the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, or even further back in the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. That's Jeff's position. The Kenneth Gentry before Jerusalem fell nonsense. And then you got hyper-preterists as well, who believe that even the second advent took place in 70 AD and we're living on the new heavens and the new earth. Most confessional Christians see full preterism or hyper-preterism as heretical, and it is heretical. Jesuit origins of modern-day preterism. Louis de Alcazar was a Spanish Jesuit theologian known for putting forward what would later be called a preterist view of biblical prophecy. Why did the Jesuits come up with preterism? It is cause for a lamentation that otherwise Bible-believing Christians should fall for the errors, falsehoods, and lies of the preterist interpretation first put forth by the Jesuits in order to counter the Protestant Reformation. That's why the Jesuits came up with this nonsense, because they were trying to counter what the Protestant reformers were teaching concerning the identity of Antichrist. Futurism, as opposed to preterism, teaches that the majority of the events depicted in the book of Revelation, especially the prophecies in Daniel, Paul, and Revelation concerning Antichrist, are still in the future. Notice how this is all about the identity of the Antichrist. Preterism and futurism and historicism are all get their names and their labels from how they identify the Antichrist in Scripture and history. Basic outline of futurist thought. Antichrist will be future, a single solitary individual human being. That's where futurism comes from. Antichrist will only reign on the earth for about 3.5 years before the second advent. Bitterly oppose the saints of Christ, will build a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, make a, quote, peace treaty with the Jews or the modern nation state that calls itself Israel. Read Daniel 9:24-27. There's no peace treaty in there. There's a covenant. Covenant is not a modern day peace treaty. But this is why modern day dispensational futurists always seem to have their eyes fixated on the Middle East and especially the role of the United States in it. Dispensational futurists will even vote in presidential elections based upon their false eschatological views concerning the nation state of Israel. Jesuit origins of modern day futurism. So you see the Jesuit origins of preterism and the Jesuit origins of modern-day futurism. Francisco Ribera, later followed by Robert Bellarmine, was a Spanish Jesuit identified with the futurist Christian eschatological view. The Antichrist as a single individual would do all these things. Mr. Diabolical, Nikolai Carpathia from the Left Behind series or some such thing. To accomplish this, Francisco Ribera, the Jesuit, understood the 1260 days, 42 months, and 3.5 times, or time times half a time, literally, and rejected an interpretation of 1260 years that the reformers were giving. Now, reformers like, for example, Jonathan Edwards, the time when the reign of Antichrist began, it is certain that the 1260 days, or years, 1260 literal years did not begin before the year of Christ 479 AD. That is, before the fall of the Roman Empire. The 1260 years began after the fall of the Roman Empire. The rise of Antichrist was gradual. The Christian church corrupted itself. Think 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the apostasy, the falling away. The falling away. The restrainer had to be taken out of the way in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. That was the Roman Empire before the man of sin, son of perdition, could take his seat in the temple of God, claiming himself to be God. That is, in the church. The temple is the church. The temple on earth is the church. There is a temple in heaven, but the temple on earth is the church. In many things, the church corrupted itself presently after Constantine's time, growing more and more superstitious in its worship, and by degrees, right? The little horn of Daniel chapter 7 started off little and then grew into a sea beast, an empire, bringing in many ceremonies into the worship of God, till at length they brought in the worship of saints and set up images in their churches. The Bishop of Rome assumed more and more authority to himself. After that, he claimed the power of a temporal prince and was wont to carry 2 swords. At the time Jonathan Edwards is writing this, now they have the 2 keys to signify that both the temporal and spiritual keys were both his. Here it's the swords, the 2 swords. Emperors received their crowns at his hands. If the Pope was pleased to excommunicate a prince or a king, all that king's subjects were at once freed from their allegiance to him and obligated by the Pope not to own their own king anymore. As the Pope and his clergy robbed the people of their ecclesiastical and civil liberties and privileges, so they also robbed them of their estates and drained all Christendom of their money. See how well this agrees with the prophecies of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the man of sin, son of perdition. Right? The man of sin, son of perdition. So that he sits as God in the temple of God, that is in the church of God. Not a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, and not the temple that was standing when Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, his second letter to the Thessalonians. Daniel 7, the little horn. The 10 horns, right? The little horn, the 3 horns of the 10 are plucked up by the roots, and the little horn, that horn, the little horn, a mouth that spoke very great things, beheld the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them. How? With false doctrine and false teaching, because in their apprehension, if the Pope put an interdict on your state or kingdom, which was a sentence pronounced by the Pope against that state or kingdom, whereby all sacred administrations among them could have no validity. So they looked upon themselves in their apprehension. They were looked upon in a miserable and damnable state, and therefore dreaded it as they would a storm of fire and brimstone from heaven. Talk about making war against the saints and prevailing over them, just like the prophecy tells us. Revelation 13, the sea beast, and Revelation 17, the scarlet harlot. All of these are talking about the Antichrist papacy. The papacy. So, yes, Jeff Durbin, you must be dogmatic that the book of Revelation was written prior to 70 AD. I don't have to be dogmatic about it, but you can't not be dogmatic about it. And you're lying to yourself and lying to your listeners if you say, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It does matter for you. It doesn't matter for me. I know what it's talking about. You don't. You're falling into this preterist nonsense from Kenneth L. Gentry and others. Okay? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Scathing rebuke of this nonsense from preterists, lying to themselves, blind leaders of the blind. We'll talk to you soon. Soli Deo Gloria.